When we look at the American Revolution in Virginia, we often focus on the aristocratic estates of the Tidewater. But the war's survival hinged on the Piedmont, a rugged, isolated stretch of mountains and valleys in the south-central part of the state. By the late 1770s, the Continental Army faced total collapse. British forces were aggressively sweeping through the American South, and General Nathaniel Greene desperately needed a massive influx of fresh manpower to hold the line. To fill the ranks, Greene called on the men of Bedford, Halifax, and Pittsylvania counties. These were ordinary farmers, hard-working hatters, and skilled silversmiths who had already survived local frontier conflicts, like the 1774 Battle of Point Pleasant against Native American forces. Sending thousands of these men away created a demographic vacuum. The quiet agricultural frontier was suddenly drained of its fighting-age population, leaving the communities behind responsible for their own survival. Nathaniel Greene's survival in the South depended on a steady flow of calories as much as a steady supply of soldiers. His forces were starving, and human endurance only lasts as long as the food supply. The Virginia Piedmont organized an immense supply response. Bedford, Halifax, and Pittsylvania funneled over 121,000 pounds of flour south. Yet this isolated line was extremely vulnerable to Tory loyalists, colonists actively disrupting the rebellion. The men guarding these shipments were far from the highly drilled troops seen in military paintings. They carried practical, unstandardized frontier weapons, early firearms that used a piece of striking flint to ignite the powder. The Southern campaign relied on this fragile, makeshift supply chain. Without the labor of civilians in the Piedmont, the Continental Army would have lacked a basic material required to stay in the field. While the supplies moved south, the men who left the Piedmont faced a grueling physical reality. They were thrust into the chaotic center of the war's most brutal battlefields. These local militiamen marched hundreds of miles through brutal terrain to guard critical lead mines, eventually digging trenches and maintaining fortifications under constant fire during the Siege of 96. The reality of militia combat was unpredictable. During a nighttime British attack at the Siege of 96, Bedford's own Captain Adam Clemens famously ordered a retreat and deserted his unit while under fire. Despite their commander's desertion, the enlisted men refused to break. They stood their ground, held the line, and successfully repulsed the British attack on their own. This battlefield resilience relied on local community bonds. These men fought effectively because of the peer reliance they placed on the neighbors and family members standing right next to them. Back in Virginia, a different kind of crisis was unfolding. The troops fighting in the Carolinas were rapidly burning through their clothing, leaving the men fighting in literal rags. Fixing this required intense domestic labor. Women across the Piedmont organized to hand-make the necessary gear, spinning, weaving, and sewing hundreds of shirts, shoes, and overalls to ship to the front lines. They also absorbed a massive medical burden. Women like Catherine Davenport turned their homes into makeshift hospitals, with records showing she housed and nursed a severely wounded soldier for 70 consecutive days. The economic desperation is permanently etched into these county court ledgers. Emergency stipends, like these 10- and 15-pound payouts, were authorized to keep families of deployed soldiers from starving. These daily administrative entries reveal local officials performing constant triage to prevent total economic collapse. The surviving administrative records describe a domestic front functioning as an organized logistical hub, providing the constant maintenance required to keep a kinetic army in the field. Tracking the actual survival rates and injuries for these militiamen is incredibly difficult today, mostly because informal frontier units rarely kept detailed military records. The physical toll of the war only surfaced decades later with the Federal Pension Act of 1832. This legislation forced proud, aging veterans to submit detailed applications documenting their service and poverty to secure a meager payment. These documents expose a severe physical toll. Halifax's John Seamster testified to losing an arm after receiving multiple bayonet and sword wounds, while Thomas Lester detailed losing 3 fingers to a British broadsword. These applications transform a decades-old conflict from a collection of grand strategies into a granular record of permanent physical damage. While the men eventually got their names into federal pension files, the women who ran the logistical front were largely erased from the era's primary histories. We only know about local leaders like Sarah and Frances Tate, who helped maintain societal order in Bedford, through fragments of local lore and family histories. The most concrete documentary proof of their contribution exists in the mundane legal ledgers of the time. In these Virginia court records, women like Mary Ann Robinson and Elizabeth Baldwin received community support while their husbands fought. Preserved in faded ink, their identities represent the massive labor force that truly sustained the Continental war machine. Ultimately, the war's outcome was determined on these two fronts: the blood of Piedmont farmers on the battlefield and the labor of the women who engineered the logistics of their survival.